We are quickly approaching Rosh Hashanah, the beginning and the head of the Jewish New Year. And we are also going to be reading the Torah portion entitled Nitzavim. And there is a connection between the two. There are many connections. The first connection is that the Hebrew word Nitzavim means standing firm. And when the Torah says, you are standing today, the Alter Rebbe explains that today refers to Rosh Hashanah, that we are confident that on the day of Rosh Hashanah we will stand firmly, we will be victorious, we will prevail. How are we so certain that we will prevail? So the answer is also provided for in this week's Torah portion. A few verses later, the Torah describes Moses' words of rebuke of the Jewish people and warning them for the future. And he says to them, perhaps there is among you a root that is sprouting, a bitter root, hemlock and wormwood, such that when he hears the words of this oath, and he will convince himself in his heart, saying, I will be okay, even if I follow my heart's desires. And God continues to say that this person will suffer the consequences. So here the Torah speaks about a root of evil, a bitter root, and it uses the example of hemlock and wormwood, which I guess are bitter. And commentators point out that if we take the Hebrew words over here in this verse, Shoresh, Pora, Rosh, Vilana, a root that produces wormwood and hemlock, those four words, the initials of which form the word shofar. So we have a hint to the mitzvah of shofar in this week's portion that we read before Rosh Hashanah. And what does it suggest? That the power that we have to be victorious in our judgment, this power comes from the shofar. But how does the shofar do it? Because the shofar has the power to dig deep into the very roots of evil, to the most bitter roots of evil. And it can extract them, refine those roots, beautify those roots. In fact, the word shofar comes from a root which means to make beautiful, to take the bitter roots and not only to sweeten them, but to make them palatable, make them beautiful and wonderful. That's the power that shofar has. How does this power work? Before I go on, the hint is also in the very words over here. You have the word Rosh, and you have all the letters of the words Rosh Hashanah in this phrase, the root that produces hemlock and wormwood. So we have a reference and a hint to Rosh Hashanah based on the idea that the shofar, which is hinted in these words, has the power to reach to the roots. Now, it doesn't say the fruits of evil. That's a much more common expression. When a person does something evil, he produces fruits of evil. Just like there are fruits that are positive, there are also evil fruits, rotten fruits. But here he's talking about the root. So to understand what he means by this and why the shofar is so unique, more than any other power that we have in Judaism, that it could get to the very depths of our psyche and refine us, we have to try to define what a root means in relation to our psyche. In Hasidic philosophy, it describes the different layers of the soul. The soul itself is usually described as consisting of intellect, that's the way we understand things, and emotion, the way we relate, the way we emote. But intellect and emotion have to be expressed different ways. They can be expressed through thought, speech, or action. These, the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, refers to as the garments of the soul. They are instruments of the soul, but they're like garments because if your thoughts are positive, it beautifies you, it protects you, it is shaped according to your contours. In other words, your thoughts, speech, and action define what your mind is like, what kind of attitudes do you have, what's your mindset, and it also describes your emotions. If you shout with anger, then you know the person is angry. And you can tell a person's mood, you can tell a person's emotions and intellect by their thought, speech, or action. But of these three, thought, speech, and action, thought is the deepest. Thought is the root of your speech and action, because before you say something, at least most people, think. And even if you don't think every time, it's because you already thought it through previously. So thought is the root of speech and action. Before you do something, you think about what you're going to do. Now, in terms of evil, which is worse? Is it worse to do evil things, let's say harm other people, or is it worse to think about harming other people? Most people would say, obviously, the action is the most important part of your soul's expression, because if your actions are negative and evil, it will cause a lot of harm. Whereas if your thoughts are negative and evil, it won't cause as much harm. It'll maybe cause harm to you, but not to others. But on the other hand, the Alter Rebbe explains in the Tanya that it's worse, in a way, to think ill of others than lashon hara, than to speak ill of others. Now, speaking ill of others, the Talmud considers to be one of the most egregious sins, and it's very powerfully destructive. It says it can kill three people: the speaker, the listener, and the person about whom they're speaking. And as the Baal Shem Tov explains, that the reason why speech could harm the person about whom they're speaking is because people who have faults, but many of their faults are more or less suppressed, they're not active. But if you speak, speech has the power to expose things, to magnify things, to bring them to the surface. So even if you have some hidden evil inside of you, if you speak ill of it, of that person who has that evil will come out to the surface and become stronger. So you're harming the person about whom you're speaking. And of course, you're harming yourself because you're speaking ill, and you're harming the listener because he's not protesting, he's not walking away. So lashon hara is a very serious transgression, but yet the Alter Rebbe says that thinking ill of another is worse. Why is it worse? So the truth is that it depends what we're discussing. If we're talking about the impact on the world, speech and action have a greater impact, negative or positive, than thought. But in terms of affecting yourself, in terms of polluting your soul, the thought has a greater effect on damaging your soul, because thought is so closely connected to your soul. It's a garment that you cannot remove. Just like the human body, we have the skin, which is like a garment to the internal organs, but we also put on a jacket. We could remove the jacket, as important as it may be, we can take it off, but we can't take off our skin. We can take off our speech. We could cease talking. We could cease acting, but we can't cease thinking. So when our thoughts are no good, it chafes the soul because it's so closely attached to the soul. It's more damaging. Yes, thought and speech and action will cause more damage to the outside. So what are we saying over here? That thought is the root. And when the thoughts are bitter, when the thoughts are unsavory, when the thoughts are destructive, that is a much more damaging thing. And the shofar reaches those roots. The shofar could help us change our thought processes. But the thought is still not the deepest part of us, because intellect and emotion are deeper than our thoughts. The thought is merely a means through which we express our ideas and our feelings. But thought is nevertheless an expression of those ideas and feelings. It's a garment, but it's not the soul itself. The soul itself is the mind and the heart, the intellect and the emotions. But even that's not the deepest part of us. We have a core that is, you could say, subconscious, subliminal, that doesn't express itself most of the time. But that core could be very bitter, even if the outside seems to be very smooth and very positive, a person can have a very evil, negative core. That is the root of the person. The Talmud tells a story of the great sage Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai, who lived at the time of the Second Temple's destruction and shepherded the Jewish people during that very, very calamitous time. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai literally saved Judaism and, by extension, saved the Jewish people. On his deathbed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai started crying and he said, "I don't know where I'm going." In other words, I may leave this world and enter into paradise on one hand, but I might also be taken to the other place, the Jewish equivalent of hell, Gehenna, where the soul has to be cleansed. And the question is asked, of all people, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai had to worry about having to be punished in the next world when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai saved the Jewish people. His whole career was learning Torah, teaching Torah, saving the people. He would go down in history as one of the most significant Jewish leaders of all times. If I had to draw a list of 10 really important Jewish leaders, crucial Jewish leaders, he would probably enter into that list. And he, among all the other sages, was crying, not knowing where he would go. And the Rabbi answers in one of his discourses that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai was so busy doing what he did to save the Jewish people, he never had a chance, he never had the opportunity to introspect. So while he knew that his thoughts were good, his speech was good, his actions were good, his mind was in the right place, his heart was in the right place, but he didn't know what lurked beneath the surface. Maybe he had a corrupt core, a bitter core, and that was never touched and was never refined, was left in its raw state. And that's why on his deathbed it was the first opportunity he had to dig deep into his psyche to see whether he had that bitter core and whether he was able to eradicate it. That's what the shofar is all about. The shofar is about digging deep. Yes, throughout the year we're always introspecting, we're always doing mitzvahs that refine us, but those actions touch the part of the human psyche that are close to the surface. When we say words of Torah, we refine the power of speech. When we give tzedakah, for example, we refine the power of action. When we think words of Torah, we refine the thoughts of Torah, and so on and so forth. But on Rosh Hashanah, with the power of shofar, we are able to dig deep into the very core of our psyche, and we're able to excavate that hidden core, that subconscious, that unconscious core, and we're able to extricate it, refine it, polish it, and beautify it. As I mentioned before, the word shofar comes from the word that means to beautify. The rest of the year we can't do that. We can't go so deep, dig so deep. And this explains why it says that before Mashiach comes, God will blow the great shofar. What does that mean? Why do we need the great shofar? One way of understanding that is, if you look at recent history, the last century or so, you see that the paradox is that some of the worst things in all of human history had occurred. The Holocaust, the advent of communism, which murdered more people than anyone else in history. You have the radical, fanatical, religious groups who believe in genocide, who want to wipe out the Jewish people. To this day, they espouse that genocidal thought. And at the same time, you had the greatest, most wonderful things. Some of the most holy people represented us in the 20th centuries. We have the Rabbi. We have so many other luminaries. We have so much Torah that is revealed that is unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands of volumes are being produced and available and accessible to everyone. We have medical miracles and marvels. We're able to cure illnesses that we can never do. We have a longer lifespan. We can go on talking about the negatives and the positives. And the answer to that is, Throughout history, we were dealing with the surface and even beneath the surface phenomena, good and evil. So we saw surface good and we saw surface evil, and we dealt with the evil with the surface good. But as we come close to the end of exile, to the beginning of the age of redemption, the Messianic age, this is where the root has to be dealt with. We've never really gotten to the roots of evil, this bitter root. And in order for us to reach that bitter root, and we do so by uncovering the deepest spiritual, unconscious levels of our soul, we need the great shofar. The great shofar is what is the primal cry that comes from the very bottom of and the very essence of our being, that has the power to eradicate whatever bitter roots may still be around in our souls. This is the power of shofar. And that's why when we sound the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and while we're sounding the shofar, we're opening ourselves up to experiencing the deepest parts of our soul. That's what the shofar does for us on Rosh Hashanah. Any other time of the year, it doesn't have that effect. But on Rosh Hashanah, it has that effect. That guarantees us that we will be victorious in our judgment. And that will be the power that will bring an end to exile, because we will have gotten rid of not just the surface evil, we will be able to get rid of the roots of evil. A root for a root. The roots of our soul as revealed to eradicate the roots of evil that lurks beneath the surface. May everyone have a kativa v'chatima tova, to be inscribed and sealed for a good year and a sweet year, as opposed to the bitter roots. We should have a year of sweet roots and sweet fruits for us and all of the Jewish people, and ultimately for the entire world.